Hey guys, Jordan here from BDS Suspension, and today I have a 2018 Jeep JL Wrangler, and I'm going to be installing our 3-inch suspension system on it. Now as you can see here, I have the kit laid out in front of me. This kit contains our heavy-duty coil springs for the front and rear. We have track bar brackets, our bump stop extensions, front and rear sway bar links, all the necessary hardware you need, a front heavy-duty track bar, and for this kit we have options for shocks. We have our BDS NX2s, our Fox 2.0 Performance Series, and for this particular vehicle, we are installing our all-new Fox Performance Series 2.5 shocks. Now, if you want to learn more about these shocks, we have a link in the description below where we talk all about these shocks. Now, once you got the Jeep up in the air and your wheels and tires off, our first step is we're going to disconnect the track bar from the axle here. We're going to use a 21mm socket and a swivel. On the back side, there's a nut tab, so as soon as you start spinning it, it'll just kind of hold itself. And then when you are doing this and removing this, there's a lot of load on this axle, so it might shift one way or another. So just be mindful of that. Like that, it just moved a little bit. Now we're gonna do the same thing on the frame side here with that track bar. We're just gonna remove this bolt. This is a 21mm socket and wrench. There's no nut tab on this side. So remove that. Remove this bolt. And we're just going to remove the track bar from the vehicle. Now we're just going to remove our lower sway bar links, bolts from our axle here. On this side, we don't really have much room, so we're going to use an 18mm ratcheting wrench. We're just going to break that free and wrench that all the way out. There's a nut tab sitting in this pocket here, so you just kind of... Now on the driver's side sway bar link, we do not have a nut tab, so we're just going to use a 18mm wrench and socket. Loosen it here and just remove that bolt. Now we're going to remove our sway bar link from our sway bar. It is just a stud with an 18mm nut on it, so we're just going to remove that. And do that on both sides. Our next step is we're going to remove this nut from this stud on this lower control arm here. It's a 15mm socket. Just remove that and remove that bracket from the arm. Save that nut and do that on each side. And then under here, we're gonna remove our 4 drive shaft flange bolts. It's 15 as well. And then this might, once you get this loosened, this might be stuck just from the elements. Just have to give it a good whack. May have to use a hammer. When you do hit this with a hammer, make sure that you try to use a mallet of some sort. Don't damage it with the actual metal hammer. Just remove that from that flange there. Our next step is we're gonna remove these 2 bolts here that hold our brake line brackets on. So it's a 10mm socket for each one. Just remove each one of those bolts. And then when you do get this one removed, you might have to remove the shock first, but you can pull this out. And just pull that out. Now this line right here is to our 4-wheel drive actuator. We are going to remove the clips that are holding this to the arm and the axle. So let's take a little trim tool, pop those guys out of there. Now we're gonna unplug this here. There's this little white clip up here, and you're just gonna take a screwdriver or your clip tool, pop that white clip out, and it doesn't come out very far. Push down on it once it does, and just remove that connector. Now we're going to remove our lower shock bolt. It's an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. And once you remove that nut here with our hoist and our stands, we're just going to go find that happy spot to where this shock will pull out. So you might be too high up. Just kind of find the happy medium of where it wants to sit in the trim to pull it out. Now we're going to go up with our hoist or just down with your axle. We're going to raise it up and we're going to remove these springs, but when you are lifting up, just make sure there's not tension on everything that we removed here, and do watch that drag link at the pitman arm there because you don't want to rip that boot and overextend it. And then also watch the drive shaft. Make sure it doesn't get caught on the axle and hold you up. We're going to go up. And then we're going to just remove these factory springs. And there is an isolator up here. You can just leave that in place for now. Now, once you got your springs out, we're gonna go ahead and just hook our shocks back up on each side here. Now we're gonna remove our front lower control arm bolt from the vehicle. So on the back side here, you're gonna have to use a 24mm wrench. And then here, on the bolt head, it'll be a 21mm socket. So loosen that nut. And then you might have to adjust your axle to be able to pull this out cleanly. But here we're pretty much perfect, so go ahead and pull that. And it's still a little bound up. So Nate's gonna watch his head. And we're just gonna loosen this, and it's just gonna swing down. Like that. Now for this particular kit, we offer you cam plates for your lower control arm. That's why we removed the lower control arm here. And this is gonna adjust for your alignment for your caster. So these little cam plates, you can see that they're just like a rectangle square. And there's little notches here on the factory axle. So these cams are gonna sit in there like this with the hole backwards, just like that. And it's gonna sit in that slot. So you can see that there's a lot of material still there. So you'll have to grind out all that material to be able to slide your bolt through. And so you have to do that on each side. So once you get that grinded out, just take your factory control arm and your factory bolt and just kind of line that arm back up with those new cam hole positions and slide it through. Best trick is probably use a die grinder. If you don't have a die grinder, you can maybe use a small flat disc, but the best trick by far is a die grinder, and just grind that out. And do not go too far to take that slot out, and you'll feel them, because if you do, your cam won't have anywhere to sit and you'll be in the wrong position. It'll just kind of freely move back and forth. So as right now it sits in those slots, so make sure you not grind out too far and take those notches away. And if you do not want to do this part, we do offer an upgraded lower control arm with our suspension system, and so you don't have to do any grinding. It's just a plug and replace type deal. Now once we do our lower control arm, our next step is we're going to remove our lower shock bolt on each side. And just like before, we're going to go up with our hoist, down with our axle, and we're just going to go up enough to be able to fit those new springs in. So just watch for everything with tension and make sure nothing gets bound up. Just keep watching your lines, watch your pitman arm, drag link end, keep on going. And that should be enough. And you may lift it up enough, but your arms will hold up your axle for the time being. Also, drag link is kind of helping there, which it shouldn't be, but it is. Now here's our factory coil spring and our new heavy duty BDS coil spring. You see here on the factory spring, there's this little rubber isolator here. So we're just gonna basically put that in the same generic spot of where that one was, and it basically just kind of will wind up. And it may be glued on from the factory, so it may be a little bit more difficult to get off than I just made it look. This should be good enough. We're gonna take this, and then we're gonna take our new provided bump stop. And remember this isolator, it does have a little nub on it. So basically just line it up to where this isolator is sitting completely flat on this axle, or on this frame here. And there's a couple different holes, so you just have to kind of find where it sits at. And it might hold itself. So then this is the lower part, because this is bigger, so the smaller part goes to the top. Make sure that you put this in. So push up here, you might have to go up a little bit more. And then just kind of line that up to where it needs to sit. Put that bump stop. Bump stop can go in either way, doesn't really matter. There's no upside down, and do that on each side. Now once you got those coil springs and bump stop extensions in, we're gonna lower the hoist here. And just make sure that when you're doing this, that everything kind of stays in its place. And you can feel that nub up there on the top of the frame. Make sure it's in place, make sure that this stays in place. Make sure nothing's getting pinched while you go down, and just put enough pressure on these just to kind of hold them in place here on each side. Now we provide you with new 3/8 hardware here to attach bump stop to the axle. So part of the reason we didn't go all the way down, because that coil spring would be more compressed, and we didn't want to be able to not fit this in here and fit your hand in here. So there's a hole from the factory just on this axle mount. So just put that bolt through that hole. We removed this earlier, so just kind of take your hand and start this nut. Now once you have your bolt installed to your bump stop extension, we're going to go ahead and tighten this bolt. Now this is a 3/8 bolt, so we're just going to take our 9/16 ratchet. You can use a wrench or whatever you have. And on the bottom we have a serrated flange nut, so you don't need to have a wrench hold that. And so you just push up against the axle with that nut, and that nut will kind of just hold itself in place while you're tightening this bolt. Now we're going to hook up our brake line brackets. We have 2 different bolts here from these brake line brackets. This one doesn't really have a washer on it, so we'll start that one there. This one has a little bit of a bigger washer there, you see. So this has a little tab here, and there's a hole on this side. Slide it in that hole, and then just line up the bolt with the nut. Tighten them down with your 10mm socket. Those are very easy to break and strip, so be careful of that. And then make sure that you hook up your factory brake line bracket on the lower control arm with that nut on the stud. Now our next step is we're going to remove the upper shock bolt here. This is a pretty long bolt, and it's an 18mm socket. So if you want, you can heat up a razor blade and cut this kind of the contour to make you have a little bit more access. But here we're just going to push it out of the way with our socket and impact. And kind of fight it over that fender. Pull this bolt out, take your shock out. Now it's time to install our Fox 2.5 aluminum body shock. So here we have the rubber style bushings, and here you can see this offset here. This is going to go on the upper part, and this offset is going to go inward, and that's just going to push that body away, being that larger body, away from the frame here. So we're going to push that up there, take your bolt, your factory bolt. It's just a nut tab or a welded nut up there, so just kind of find the home for it and get it started. So when we get that started, we don't want to tighten it completely because those are rubber style bushings, and they will bind up if we tighten them in the air, so we'll have to tighten those on the ground completely. So now our next step is we're going to go down with our hoist or up with your axle, and we're going to line the lower shock eye up with the mount on the axle. Nate's going to help here. And then just take your factory bolt, stick it through. Now we're just going to hook up our actuator here. We're going to click that in, push that white tab back in, and then just hook up your clips again. And since you're under here, we're going to hook up our drive shaft. So we're going to use our factory bolt to make sure that you do Loctite those. Get them all started by hand first. Now once you have all those started by hand, we're going to just snug each one up. 15mm socket, kind of go in a star pattern. And then once you get them all snugged, we're just going to hit them again. Now moving on to our sway bar links here. In this particular kit, we offer you the JKS quick disconnects. Now if you have a Rubicon model, they come factory with electronic disconnect, so you don't have to do this next step. So, but in this case, since it does not have electronic disconnect, we're going to cut this factory tab off here. So we're going to measure 1.25 inches from the center of this hole over and just cut this tab off here, and then we'll go from there. Now once you get that cut off, we're just going to clean it up a little bit, just make sure there's no sharp edges. Now once you got that grinded nice and flat, we're just going to take some paint and spritz it on there. That's just going to stop it from rusting. So now here I have our disconnect mounting post, and you see that one is obviously longer than the other one. So on the passenger side, on the side we just cut, we're going to put the shorter one. So we're just going to go through the factory hole here, start this nut. Now on the driver's side, we're just going to take our other mounting post, start it with our nut, and in this case we have this little spacer, rubber spacer here. This is going to slide across and sit right there. Now this is a nylock locking nut, so this will just spin if you try to tighten it. So you can either take a screwdriver or a punch and stick it in that hole, and when we do tighten it, we're going to make sure that hole is vertical up and down. But I like to use vice grips here, and we're just going to take our 19mm socket, hold that vice grip where it needs to be, and just kind of Work it back and forth with both of them. Now with our quick disconnects here, we're going to install the sleeves on the upper part of the disconnect. So that is the shorter part with the sticker nut on it. And the sleeves are a little bit longer than the bushings. I'll show you why here in a little bit. So for a good starting point here, from eye to eye, center to center, we're going to go 9 inches. We have to go another inch. And this is just a good starting point for these, and they can be finely tuned on the ground. So we'll say, so right there. So this is the passenger side. So in this case, we're going to take our quick disconnect, and this is one of those rubber bushings that we use on the stud on the lower on the driver's side. We're just going to slide that over that sleeve. The lower part, we don't have a sleeve. That's where the mounting post comes in hand. We're going to slide that over that, and then we're just going to move our sway bar freely and just line up the hole, and then take your jam nut and just put that on there, and then we're going to take our provided hardware and stick it through that. Now with the sway bar link, we provide you with these little quick pins. That's why we made this stud, that hole on there, vertical, so we can just easily slide that quick pin out. So go ahead, slide that in there, click that down, take your provided hardware, put bolt side here, line that up, nut and washer on the back side. Now on the driver's side, kind of the same situation, but here we have to use one of those spacers on the stud. So slide this over, and then we're going to use the spacer on the inside of this. And we're just going to line this up, throw that through, take your pin, find the hole, lock it down. Now we're just going to pop these little red caps off. They just kind of slide over the grease fitting. And then we're going to grease this. You can just use any generic grease, it's fine. This one will probably take not very much grease, and you just want to grease it until it starts to ooze out the side here. Just like that. And then the bottom, you're basically going to fill this whole tube and then wait for it to ooze out, so it's going to take a little bit more. But we'll get it to work. Just like that. Comes out, and do that on each side. Now we're just going to tighten this bolt on the driver and passenger side for the sway bar disconnect here. You're going to use a 19mm socket and wrench. Now we're just going to tighten this jam nut. This is a 15/16 wrench, or 24 works too, and just tighten that on the bottom part of the disconnect. Make that nice and snug. And this is going to stop these threads from getting destroyed on this. Now next we're going to install our sway bar disconnect holding post. Now there's a hole from the factory on the side of the coil bucket here, and these only go on one way. You can kind of see the machining of this. It's kind of formed to the coil bucket. So take your provided hardware, put that in there, put it through the factory hole. You may have to push the fender liner out of the way. And if you have the disconnect option on your, if you have a Rubicon model, you don't need these, but they do come with every kit. So if you want to put it on, you can put it on. It's not going to affect anything. You just won't technically need to use it. Now we're just going to take our 1/2-inch wrench and socket and tighten this down. Now the purpose of these mounting brackets here is for these quick disconnects. So the whole point of this pin here is we're going to pull that pin and pull that off the stud, and then rotate that up, and you're going to have to do that on each side. So then when you're off-roading, you can push the sway bar up, slide this over just like that, and put your pin back in, and this will just hold your sway bar up out of the way. Now we're going to install our BDS heavy duty track bar. Now this can only go on one way. You can see this bend in it, and then this little collar down here with the end. So this end is going to go on the axle side, and this bend is for clearance from the axle housing here. So we're going to put this in just like this, and we're just going to put this bolt in for now, and it's going to be a factory bolt. Just line it up and put your nut on it and wait to tighten that. And then this just sit kind of in that pocket for now. Now moving on to the rear, our first step is we're gonna, just like the front, we're gonna disconnect the track bar here. We're just gonna disconnect it from the axle, but we're gonna leave it on the frame end. It's a 21mm socket. There is a nut tab back here, so you don't need a wrench. And once again, the axle will probably shift one way or another. Next step is we're just gonna remove this brake line bracket from the frame here. It's a 10mm socket. Just remove that bolt. And do that on each side. So now our next step underneath the vehicle in the rear here, we are gonna remove the bracket that holds the e-brakes to the vehicle itself. Now you can see that there's this little cross member here and then the filler tube. So we're gonna go in between that, and you'll see if you just follow these e-brakes up, you'll see this little like Y bracket with a bolt in the middle of it. So this is kind of where you can access that between that cross member and the filler neck. Be careful because there are some brake lines going there, so just be careful not to kink those. You'll take a 13mm socket and remove this bracket. That's what that bracket looks like. Now we're going to remove this little plastic shield here. This is just covers the upper shock bolt, and we just need to remove this to gain access to that. So there's 3 bolts, 2 right here, 1 right here. They're just going to take an 8mm socket. Remove all these. Don't do what I'm just doing. And remove this plastic. Now we're going to remove our lower shock bolt here, 18mm socket and wrench here. Once again, just like the front, just trying to find that happy spot. Now next step is we're just going to loosen this upper shock bolt. We're not going to fully remove it. You can if you want to, but I'm not going to quite yet. And when you loosen it, it's just going to swing back, so be careful of that. Do that on each side. Next, we're going to remove the sway bar links from the axle. These are just 18mm sockets with a wrench. So do that on each side here. And then when you get both bottom bolts off the sway bar links here, just push up on the front, give yourself more access, and you're going to remove this nut on this sway bar link. It's just an 18mm socket. And just remove that link. Now we're just going to go up with our hoist or down with your axle, and we're just going to release the pressure to be able to get those springs out. Just once again watch your lines, and then your arms will probably hold this up higher than what you want it to for when you get your new ones in, but just pull these old ones out and get rid of them. Now our next step is we're going to install our track bar bracket. So in this case, we're not going to replace the track bar, we're just going to use a track bar bracket. So this part right here goes on the front face, and this hole, the bottom hole, lines up with the factory original mounting hole. This brace goes on the back side through that bolt, and then you'll just line those holes up with each other and then just mark, and we'll have to drill those out. So just mark once you get these lined up. If you want, you can tighten this with a nut and washer, but this should be good enough. Now that you have your holes marked, just go ahead and take a center punch and just mark the center of those holes. And then what I like to do here is if you want to just burn up a 1/2 inch drill bit, that's fine, and just send it. But I like to work my way up, so I'm going to start off with an 1/8 inch drill bit and then get a step bit and just work up to a 1/2 inch, because the bolts we do provide for this side is a 7/16, and that half would just allow for a little bit more slop and variance if you do not get that perfectly centered. So go ahead and just work your way up. Now once you have your holes drilled out, make sure that you paint them so they don't rust. And we provide you with this sleeve. So this sleeve is going to go the factory location here, because there's nothing that's going to stop it from crushing. So we're going to take this sleeve, and that's going to go right there. Take your factory, your bracket, your knee bracket. Works a little bit better with 2 people, but we can make it work here. Find that hole. line that up, and then take your brace here, go through your back hole, and then just try and line up all these holes. And put your nuts and washers on. Now we're going to tighten these 7/16 bolts. We're going to leave this one loose for now because if we tighten this bolt and put pressure this way, this will be super hard to get in and put that bolt in once we're on the ground. So on the head side here, on the bolt head side, it's a 5/8. On the nut side, it's a 11/16. So just go through the top here and start tightening until you catch the nut. It can be a pain just because of the tightness of all this. And the fucking wrench is too goddamn big. Now we're going to remove our TPMS module here. So that's your tire pressure monitoring system module. So back here, there's just two studs that are on this cross member, and they're just held on with nuts. So take a 10mm socket, remove this, save one of these nuts. You can get rid of the other one. And we're going to take this bracket here, pull it off, rotate it so it sits like this. We're going to take, there's a factory hole right here. We're just going to take that, the new provided bolt, nuts and washers. Now we're just going to take our 7/16 socket and wrench and tighten this bracket down. And just make sure that it's nice and square on it. And then just take your 10mm socket and tighten that nut down with that. Now our next step is we're going to install our rear coil springs. Now these are, just like the front, different sizes on the holes here. So the smaller part here, which will fit the isolator a lot better, will be the top, and then the bigger part will just be the bottom. And just like the front, the isolator has this little nub on it. There's only one hole up here, and you'll just have to find it and line it up and get it pushed up in there. And I'd recommend getting this in first and then messing with this nub. Now we're going to install our provided bump stop extensions. This is just a square piece of tube cut, and you can see how it's kind of cut at different angles. So we're going to put it on so it's more towards the back, so that back angle kind of slants downward. We're going to put our provided hardware through. There's just two factory holes that are right there on that pad. Just install both of those. Now once you have these bolts in, we're just going to tighten them. They're a 5/16 bolt, so you just need a 1/2 inch wrench on each side. And then we're just going to, better if you have a ratcheting, to be able to do this a little quicker. And just make sure that when you are tightening it, it's super close, but Nate can kind of show you here on the bottom here. Just make sure that that bolt is past that lock feature on that nut there. Now we're just going to reinstall our brake line brackets on each side, just the factory bolt. Make sure that you start this before you send it in with the impacts. You don't want to cross thread that. It would be super easy. Also be very careful. These will break this. Snug it up. Now our next step is we need to install our bushings and sleeves into our provided rear sway bar links. Now in our case, we do have vices and arbor press to do this. If you have that, use it, but most people probably don't. So I'm going to show you just a quick, easy way if you don't have this. WD-40 works too, but I'm just going to use some silicone spray and spray each one of these. And then I'm just going to take a mallet, a regular hammer works too. And I'm just going to pop those in there like that. All these bushings and sleeves are the same, so it doesn't matter where they go. Now we're going to install our provided sway bar links. Now you can see that they are offset one way or another, depending on which way I flip it. So we're going to want to install it so it's kind of shifted outward. So on the bottom, we're going to use our factory hardware from the bottom, and we're just going to install it through the sleeve. Put your nut on. Now on the top side, we're going to use our 12mm hardware that we provide. Just push your sway bar up and kind of line that up. Make sure you put the bolt side on the outside and then the nut on this part here on the inside of the sway bar. Now we can tighten our sway bar link bushings on the bottom side with the factory hardware. It's an 18mm socket and wrench. Tighten that up until the bushing starts to swell. On the top side here with our 12mm hardware will be a 19mm socket and wrench. Do that on each side. Now we can just fully remove the shock bolt. Just like the front, it's a pretty long bolt, maybe a little longer. And we're just gonna get rid of these shocks. And we're gonna install our new 2.5 aluminum body shocks here with that nice roost guard on it. And with the front, like the front one, it doesn't really matter. The bushings are, you know, there's no offset here because of the body. So we can just install these as is, whatever way you feel that you want to. Make sure that you do not tighten these once again because they are rubber bushing, so just snug them up. Now we're just gonna drop our Jeep down or raise our axle up until the shocks line up with the factory bolt holes. And it's gonna help us once again. Now we're just going to install our rear shock bolt here. Doesn't really matter which way you install it. Put the nut back on. Do that on each side. Now if you can here, we're going to hook up our track bar. You can see how close ours is. So you can actually move the axle and be able to hook that up. And if it's too far away, you have to just do it on the ground and it's a lot easier. Now for this e-brake cable here, you can kind of see that it's resting on that stud from where we remove that TPMS bracket. So we provide you with this clamp. So take the clamp, put it over the line and just move that line and put it on the stud on the most right. And then we provided a new washer and then just use the factory nut that was on there. Thread that on there. And that's just gonna hold that brake line off that stud. Now we're ready to throw our wheels and tires on. In this case, we are throwing on a 35 BFG Goodrich all-terrain tire. Now once your vehicle is on the ground, we're gonna go ahead and hook up our front and rear track bar if you haven't already. So the front track bar is most important here because it is adjustable. We need to make sure that our axle offset is very centered, the same measurement. So the best way to do this, if Nate comes in here, is on this coil bucket. We're just gonna take our tape measure and we're gonna hook it on there and we're gonna measure a certain spot on the tire. So let's just say the smaller lug here, the shorter lug. So let's just call that 17.5. And then you're gonna come on this side and do the exact same thing. So 17.25. So we need the axle to shift. So basically that's the whole point of the adjustable track bar is we have to shift the axle over. And the best way to do that is have somebody in it moving the steering wheel to be able to move it back and forth or just adjust your track bar as needed. Now once you have your axle where you want it at and everything's adjusted, we're gonna go ahead and install our factory bolt into the bushing here. And just remember I had a nut tab on the back side. So we're gonna take a 21mm socket, a swivel and an extension, and we're just gonna tighten that down. Now just one quick thing, when you are adjusting your track bar, make sure that this little gusset brace here is up because if it's down, your bolt won't fit in there right into the track bar. So just make sure that that little gusset is up. But our next step is we're gonna tighten this clamp. This is just the adjuster clamp that holds the adjuster tight. So this is a 5/8 socket on the bolt head side and 11/16 wrench on the nut side. Just tighten that down. Now we're going to tighten the frame end of our track bar here. This is a 21mm wrench on the nut side and 21mm socket on the bolt head side. Now our next step is we're going to tighten this track bar bracket and the track bar on the rear here. So we're going to take a 21mm socket, and for both of these are the bolts we provide, and it's a 22 on the nut side here. So it doesn't matter which one you tighten first, just tighten them both up. And the next one as well. Now our next step is, before we tighten everything else, is we need to settle the suspension. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to start the vehicle and back and go forward, back and forth, and just hit the brakes kind of hard. And you'll hear all those clunks from everything being loose, but we're just settling the suspension up. And that's why we hook our track bars up before we do that, because you won't be able to steer or move everything. So that's why we do that. We're going to go ahead and start it. And you'll hear a bunch of clunks and creaks and everything because everything's loose. Now that we got our suspension settled, we're going to go ahead and start tightening everything up. Now remember, the shocks were one thing that we left loose due to those factory style rubber bushings. So the top was just a welded nut on the frame. And so we can just go ahead and tighten that with our 18mm socket. Make sure you don't pinch the inner fender with it. And to do the passenger side, or the bottom side, you'll probably have to turn the wheel completely to be able to get access in there with your impact. And same thing, 18mm socket, and then wrench on the nut side. So now the next thing we have to tighten is our lower control arms. That's because we put those cam plates in. So we just need to tighten this bolt and this bolt. So on the bolt head side, it's a 21mm socket, and on the nut side, it's a 24mm wrench. So just tighten both of those down. Now our next step is we're going to tighten the rear shocks, because just like the front, they do have those rubber bushings. So on the upper, you'll need a swivel with an 18mm socket. And the lower, you'll need a deep well socket and a wrench. The deep well socket just because of the nuts on this side, so we won't be able to tighten it with a short one. 18mm wrench and just tighten down. So our next step, once we go out and drive it, make sure everything's tightened, is we're gonna have to adjust the steering wheel. Now you can probably do this by yourself, but using two people works a lot better, having somebody watch it. So this collar right here is what we use to adjust the steering wheel. And there's a clamp here, and we just need to loosen this clamp. So this is a 15mm. We're just gonna loosen that. And depending on how rusty your Jeep may be, we're gonna have to use a pair of pliers to adjust this. So you're just gonna turn it one way, and you're just gonna listen to your partner tell you wrong way or right way, and then just go until it's centered. So you just put your pliers on this and start turning it. In our case, it's pretty new, so, and just do this until the wheel's centered. And you'll probably have to do this a couple times just because it's not a perfect setup. And so you probably just have to kind of mess with it a couple times. So once you do, just tighten this back down and go out for another drive. Now that's how you install our BDS 3-inch suspension system. Now this particular kit is upgraded with our Fox 2.5 Performance Series shocks. The kit and the shocks are both in stock, ready to ship. And you also may notice that we have this Crawltech bumper on here. If you want to learn more about that bumper, go to crawltechrevolution.com.